Recently, I've seen 2 movies. That's probably my maximum for the year. I'm not a moviegoer, but my kids get me to watch it by saying, "You'll get illustrations out of it, Dad." So I said, "All right, I'll watch it at home." So my son brought me one of these, and I was watching them. It's called watching this one called Interstellar. It takes me a long time to track the stories. But the whole story is about that the world is going to collapse, planet Earth is going to be destroyed. They've got to find some other habitable planet somewhere. So they find this NASA pilot to somehow go to these other planets and look for possibilities. And his daughter is pleading and begging with him to not go. She needs him. "Please, Dad, don't do it." The whole story is really not so much about discovering these planets as much as it is the love between a father and a daughter. And as the daughter gets older and older and older, and the father is missing, you see the anguish of her pounding her fist. She doesn't have her dad there because he's discovering life on other planets. I was in one city in Australia, I'll leave unnamed, and the chief of police, who has 18,000 police officers working under him, sitting 2 to my right, Michael and I was speaking to these civic leaders. He leaned over to me, he was all in his uniform, and he said, "Mr. Zacharias, a week from now is Father's Day in Australia. It is the saddest day in the year for one community here that I oversee, because 90% in that community do not know who the Father is." And he says to me, "Do you know the crime and violence that comes out of these young men because they don't know who their father is?" He said, "I tell civic leaders, you're never going to solve this problem of violence until you change our homes and until you build a home where young men know what it is to see a gentleman for a father and to see the understanding of love and beauty in a relationship in a home where when you come back from school, there are arms waiting for you to wrap their arms around you." You know, both of my mom and dad had to work. My mom had to work. There were 5 of us kids. But I tell you the truth, I think I mentioned it in my biography, my sister is here from St. Catharines, Ontario. I would never go out to play till about 3:20 or 3:30 in the afternoon. I used to be cricket mad, but I would never leave the home till I'd be standing outside the home and waiting to see if my mother got off the bus. And if I saw her in the distance getting off the bus, I knew things would be okay, and I would run off to the cricket field and play. I just want to make sure my mom would be home when I got back that evening. And I was a pretty self-sufficient young man in sports and so on. The second movie that I saw was Tom Hanks' one. It was called the Bridge of Spies. You know what struck me? I won't give you the story, but he's involved in the trading of the Francis Gary Powers plane, U-2 plane that was shot down years ago. And he's trading a Soviet spy for 2 American spies. His family doesn't know he's gone. And it's all over when he comes back from Checkpoint Charlie and the trade has been made. They don't know where he is. He's told them he's somewhere else. He comes with his suitcase, walks into the house, gives his wife a hug, and he walks upstairs. And the children are watching the news and then find out their dad was involved in this negotiation of bringing 2 Americans home. And the wife runs upstairs to ask him, "Were you really involved in this?" She goes up and he's lying face down on the bed, totally exhausted, with his bags lying beside the bed. And he's slap bang on that bed, weary from all that it took from him to bring 2 lives back home. It's filial. The whole thing is really filial. The love, the whole reality of coming together and bringing you back home. I travel around the world. I go to country after country after country. And I always wait till I get back home. I always take the first flight back home. Please allow me to give you 2 personal illustrations here, and I'll move on quickly. My daughter Naomi is here. We're now the proud parents, the grandparents of 4 kids. And one day Naomi had lost her car keys, and she was walking around the house, and she's slapping her forehead and says, "I'm losing my mind." And her 3.5-year-old Jude looks at her and says, "Mommy, whatever you do, please don't lose your heart, because I'm in there." Who told him to say that? Who told him to say that? 3.5 years old. It's that longing, isn't it? It's that longing in your heart and mind from when we are children to no matter how old we are. I see grown men weeping at the loss of their parents. You're never ready to part with them. And if you'll please allow me a second illustration here from our family. Naomi recently had us in a home, brought some friends together and had me dedicate their little boy, Nico, who's just a few months old. And she prayed a prayer that day that I'll never forget. And I said, honey, can you send me that prayer? She said, Dad, it was inspired by General MacArthur's prayer for his sons. And she sent it to me. Can I read you 2 or 3 paragraphs? I pray God will make me a mother who will show you the strength to face weakness, bravery enough to face yourself when you're afraid, the grace to accept honest defeat, and the gentleness to accept victory with humility. I pray God will help me to be a mother who will show you the importance of hope in the face of darkness, yet courage to participate rather than sit on the sidelines of well wishes alone. I pray I will be a mother who will teach you the importance of a contrite heart, that the strength and courage needed to walk with a limp should never be underestimated. I pray that you will learn to laugh, yet never forget how to cry, that the family is both a gift and responsibility that is ours to nurture, that beauty comes in surprising forms, the importance of a simple kindness in a world growing exceedingly harsh and even cruel, and to reach for the future without ever forgetting the past. Lead him, Lord, not only in the path of ease and comfort, but allow the encounter of difficulties, disappointments, and failure. But I humbly ask you just this one, I plead with you. Let it be no more than he must endure to become what you long for him to be. And when he must walk through the valley, I ask with my whole heart that he will find you there, that you will not allow the core of his spirit to be crushed. Make me a mother who will sit with him in the darkness while praying each day for the light to come tomorrow, and one who will help him to learn to stand back in the storm. Please use me to help him trust you even through heartache and injustice. And in his trenches, let him learn the wonder of your grace and a compassion for those who fall. Nicole, you were a baby. We covered you with prayer in particular ways while we waited to meet you. And deep in my heart, I will always believe he gave us a miracle at that particular point in time. May you always find me to be a safe harbor. I cannot tell you where my heart ends and yours begins. Nothing could diminish my love for you. And the prayer goes on. Every mother here knows exactly what she's saying. And so when a 3.5-year-old says, don't lose your heart, I'm in there. And when a mother says, I don't know where my heart ends and yours begins, where did all this come from? Primordial slime? You can argue till all these moons have come and gone, suns have come and gone, and try to talk about all the digital possibilities, and mathematically we can go wherever all of this tries to lead us. But I'll tell you what, you can never quench the longing in your heart to be embraced, to be hugged, to be loved. From the time you're a baby till you become an adult, you always want to belong and cherish that belongingness. May we never take it for granted. This point of God's reach is filial. It's a fatherly love that he's poured into your heart and mind. The starting point may be causal in God, but the reach is filial. His love comes into your heart and mind. And that's why when he says, for God so loved, a student at the University of at Carnegie Mellon stood up, a woman, and came to me and said, how do you define love? Where do we go with love? And she wasn't being hostile. She wasn't trying to argue against it. She was just asking me how we define love. And I told her all that needed to converge into it: volition, emotion, commitment, but very importantly, the sacred.
Hi, I'm Ravi Zacharias, the director of Wellspring International. I'd like to take a minute and talk about Wellspring, which is the humanitarian arm of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. The vision of Wellspring is to identify and financially equip existing organizations aiding women and children at risk. Additionally, we work to provide individual scholarships to support education, healthcare, and basic living needs. We would love to hear from you, and we welcome your support. 100% of every gift designated for Wellspring goes directly to a project on the ground. please call us at 770-449-6766 or email us at wellspring@rzim.org. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about Wellspring International. And now let's get back to today's teaching with Ravi Zacharias.
One of the political candidates in our time was asked when she changed her opinion on marriage. Fascinating. They played 2 clips from her 1 years gone by. In the first clip, she defined love as a sacred commitment between a man and a woman made. In the second clip of how she redefined marriage, the word sacred was no longer there. All of a sudden, it had been desacralized. And so I tell you right now, the hunger of a parent, the hunger of a child, that's why the Bible says there's a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea. There's a kindness in God's justice, which is more than liberty. So while the starting point is causal, the divine reach is filial. Thirdly, the relationship, not everybody's going to be happy with this, is conditional. The relationship is conditional. I cannot enjoy fellowship with God until I believe and trust Him. Belief is that precondition of trusting. In one of the South Sea languages, they could not translate the word believe because there was no such word in the language. So the missionary translated John 3:16 with these words, that whosoever leans on you, whosoever leans on you, you're trusting your weight completely with that person. And so the relationship is conditional. Fourthly, the range is eternal. So we move from causal to filial to conditional. The fourth, the range is eternal. Death is not the worst thing that can happen. Eternal death is the worst thing that can happen. One of my great heroes and writers was a man by the name of Nicholas Walter Storff, philosopher theologian from Yale. And it happened in 2011. He got a dreaded telephone call on a Sunday afternoon that his 25-year-old son had been killed in a mountain climbing accident. He wrote a book called Lament for a Son. Pretty powerful stuff in that book. And one of the things he said, when we've explained everything away, how we can still fly, how we can conquer the heat, how we can do all these things, we still have to deal with death and the evil that is in our hearts. But here's what he says in one paragraph about his son being gone from the face of the earth. I'm now waiting for a group of students to cross the street, and suddenly I think he's not there. I go to a ball game and find myself singling out the 25-year-olds. None of them is he. In all the crowds and streets and rooms and churches and schools and libraries and gatherings of friends in our world, on all the mountains, I will not find him. I will only notice his absence. Silence. Was there a letter from Eric today? When did Eric say he would call? Now it's silence. Absence and silence. When we gather now, there's always someone missing. His absence is as present as our presence. His silence as loud as our speech. Yes, I have 5 children, but one is gone. And we're all together, we're not all together. In the neverness about it all that makes it so painful. Never again to be here with us, never to sit with us at this table, never to travel with us, never to laugh with us, never to cry with us, never to embrace us as he leaves for school, never to see his brothers and sister marry. All the rest of our lives, we must live without Eric, without him. We have to answer the question of death. Whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. No Hindu will ever tell you this. No Muslim will ever tell you this to the ground of just belief. No pantheist will tell you this. No atheist will tell you this. Jesus Christ tells you, when you believe in him, you will not perish, but have eternal, have everlasting life. Do you realize why Saul of Tarsus changed to Paul? Why Thomas the doubter was willing to allow the spear into his side? Why James the brother became the head of the church? Why the early church was transformed? It was because the hope of the resurrection that they had seen in Jesus Christ. I'm an Easterner, and I'll tell you this: if Jesus were a charlatan, I'll tell you exactly what he would have promised. After I die, when you bury me, I will spiritually rise again. But that's not what he said. He said, I will bodily rise again. He gave us the possibility of falsifying his claim. I will bodily rise again, which means if you presented the body, that would be the end of the whole thing. The hope of the resurrection. Having buried my mother and father early in life, the world never looks the same. But I'll tell you what, just to know the assurance that life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, as Longfellow was not spoken of the soul. We have that eternal life. We have that eternal value. Nobody says it better than the songwriters, and they take the scriptures. 1 Corinthians 2:9, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. In John 14, I go to prepare a place for you, because in my Father's house are many mansions, so that where I am, you may be also. Franklin Graham and I were engaged in a conversation a couple of weeks ago. We were just one-on-one in a quiet room, and he was talking to me about his dad's situation. You know, he's getting quite feeble, Ravi, quite old, but every word in that book that he's just written came from him as he dictated it, went over it, and the book is called Where I Am, and it comes from John 14, that where I am, you may be also, the eternal presence of the living God. I've never heard Billy Graham talk so bluntly about two different eternities. In fact, it is so starkly different that he's portrayed what perishing actually means, that critics are saying Dr. Graham never wrote it. Franklin Graham was looking at me and saying every word in that book was written, approved by him. He really is thinking so much of the eternal. And when Stephen is being martyred, he looks and beholds, and he sees the Son, the right hand of the Father there, standing up waiting to receive him. When my father-in-law passed away over 10 years ago, after hours and hours of silence, he lifted his head and said two things. He looked at his wife of 60-some years. All three daughters who were by his side are here tonight, my wife and two of her sisters. He opened his eyes, looked at his wife of 60-some years, and said, Jean, I love you. And then he looked to the ceiling and said, amazing, that's amazing. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. Now, several of you I know in the audience who have lost your spouse over the last 3 to 4 years. I've been there by your side. And the hope you bring is really the hope of the resurrection. Thank you for taking it with such strength. Marilyn, Ellen, Ann, several of you, thank you for being here. And the last thing I leave for you is not only is it causal, not only do we see filial, not only do we see the whole the range of it being eternal, but the last thing is, at its core, this is all judicial. At its core, this is all judicial. We don't like it, do we? We like to make a lot of lawyer jokes. I think it was Shakespeare referred to Satan as the prince of lawyers, because we see so much of it being maligned. It's not fair, because I know we get hit as preachers. They make jokes about us, politicians. Why do they do that? Because the lawyer is supposed to guard the law. Preachers are supposed to be preaching truth. The politicians are protectors of the law. You know, I was speaking to a group of lawyers once, and one of the lawyers told me a joke. He said, but don't tell it here. I said, okay. He said, they're now beginning to use lawyers in lab experiments rather than white mice. He said, there are 3 reasons. Number 1, there are a lot more lawyers around than there are white mice. Number 2, you're less prone to get attached to a lawyer than you are to a white mouse. And number 3, there are some things that even white mice will not do. Many attorneys here, my humble apologies. But you know why they make those jokes. I have a nephew who's a lawyer in Cleveland. The judge paid him the greatest compliment recently when he looked at an opposing attorney and he referred to my nephew Matthew and he said, if Matthew tells me something is true, I don't need to know anything more than that. They knew the integrity of every statement. This whole thing is judicial. There is a law by which we are bound. And you know how clever naturalists are? When you talk to them about the miracle, you know what they say? There's physical laws, there's no exceptions. Then when you talk to them about ethics, they'll say there's too many exceptions, therefore there's no law. Why? Because both of those statements lead them to the same conclusion: self-deification. There's no ethics, so we can worship ourselves. There's only naturalism, we can worship ourselves. So they run into the headwinds of environmental change and climate change, and all of a sudden they want to use the law ethically to protect what is there naturally, so that we don't ruin the environment. They have a point. Yes, of course we have to be good stewards. But what I'm saying to you is, where do you get this ought from to the naturalist? Why must I protect the environment? Why must I do anything that you ask me to do? See, the law is sacred in God's mind, but none of us could keep it. I have a powerful article here by J.I. Packer. I don't have time to deal with it, but when he is talking about the smarty pants idea, he calls it, of some kind of child torture and so on going on at the cross by the Father. Some new theologians came up with this whole thing, you're really child abuse, child torture, and sending his son to the cross. They missed the point, and the point is this: what was demanded, man should have paid. But what was demanded, only God could have paid. And what needed to be paid was by the Son, and he would pay it. Should, could, and would. Some years ago at Founders, we had a judge by the name of Brent McKnight who died very suddenly in his 50s. Brent McKnight stood in front of all of us and said, sometimes as a judge, when he makes judgment and pronounce situations, he said he would go back into his private chambers, put his face in his hands and weep. It was so hard to pronounce the law. When we were at Angola prison last week, there was a guy who was there for murdering 8 or 9 people brutally, 8 or 9 women and many more. I mentioned him this morning. And he kept looking at me and said, do you believe in the death penalty? Do you believe in the death penalty? Fascinating, isn't it? He was willing to send 10 to 15 women smashed to bits, being raped and dismembered, to an early grave. Now he wanted to know whether we believed in the death penalty for him. See, you don't work out logically what you can think about. That's what happens. And I say, our penalty was death. And I said to him, you know what? God believed in the death penalty, but there was only one who could die for what we needed. He sent his son for you and for me. And he took the price for you and for me. And as I close, I want to say to you, the understanding of the cross is so critical in our time. And I want you to think about 2 thoughts with which I bring this to a close. All the way from being causal, through being filial and eternal and so on, right down to this whole provision of judicial. You and I will never understand the cross. I'm holding before you something here. Vlad Kriznik brought it for me from Romania. My colleague Sanj and some of us were there at the home of a sculptor. He's done some beautiful stuff. And when we saw a nail that he had done to symbolize the crucifixion, there was something very unusual about that nail. You will never guess it from where you're sitting, because you cannot see what I'm going to say to you. He held that nail and he said, now put it down in front of you and look into it. The top is completely polished, and when you look into it, you see your own reflection. He said, that nail that went into the hands and feet of our Lord, you see your own face at the head of that nail. I'll leave it here later for you to come and see. You look at your own reflection so clearly in here. That's why the hymn writer says, I sometimes think about the cross and shut my eyes and try to see the cruel nails, the crown of thorns, and Jesus crucified for me. But even could I see him die, I could but see a little part of his love, like that great fire was always burning in his heart. He loves you. He loves me. Yes, it's filial, but there's that condition of belief. And finally, that range is eternal, because the judicial side of it has been paid. We should, only he could, and he would. What a glorious message we have. May God guide you tonight when you get back to your rooms, before you get to bed. Tell him to give you a fresh anointing of his love. It'll change you. Father, that song is so powerful. You inspired several to put it together. Truly, you will never be forgotten throughout heaven's eternal days. How your life flowed and your love flowed like a glorious river. Thank you for this ministry. I thank you for bringing me into it, Lord. May its best days be ahead. Be with this whole team, young, fresh, vibrant, passion. Keep our footsteps from stumbling. Hold on to us. We need you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yes, please. What's your question there for Dr. Zacharias or Abdu Murray?
Why did God put the tree in the garden to begin with? He ultimately knew what decision Adam and Eve would make. So why even put the tree there to begin with? Because it makes it just seem like we're just a big social experiment.
You know, the thing about skeptics sometimes when they ask us these questions, and I'm not saying it's you because I don't know the background from which you're coming, is oftentimes I wonder whether they realize we ask these same questions. You know, we struggle with these issues. It's not like we think these are invalid questions. They are very valid questions. But what does the question assume? The question assumes something very critical, that the answer should be coherent, because a coherent worldview is what you're really looking for. You cannot be comfortable with incoherence. And the question that was asked earlier, the whole issue of how does one talk to a Stephen Hawking? The fascinating thing about the talk that Stephen Hawking gave in 1990 at the Lady Mitchell Auditorium, which was packed, on the question of is man determined or is he free? He went through about 25 minutes of all kinds of scientific arguments and so on, and his culminating statement got an audible response of, oh my, is this the best answer we can get? And what he said at the end is, yes, we are determined. He was under the stranglehold of determinism right from the beginning in a naturalistic framework. He said, yes, we are determined, but since we do not know what is determined, we may as well not be. That was his concluding statement. Yes, we are determined, but since we don't know what is determined, we may as well not be. What he's really saying is, since we don't know the answer to the explanation for my conclusion, let us live as if it is not a legitimate conclusion. That's really what he was saying. So I say, when you're looking for a coherent worldview, look at it this way. What options would there have been for the great creator in the beginning of this? No world at all versus this world. Okay. Number two, creating a world where there would be no such thing as good or evil, an amoral world. Number three, choosing a world where we would only choose good, where we'd be predetermined to choose good. There would be the total constraint. So we've got three options. Nothing versus what we now have. No such thing as good or evil, or creating a constraint where we would only choose good and we would never make the evil choice. Or number 4, creating this kind of world where there would be the possibility of good and evil, and we are given the option of the privilege of freedom and making the choice. Out of these 4 options, this option is the only universe and the only world in which love is possible. In the previous 3, love is not possible at all. Love would not have been possible between the divine and human interaction. So I say this, sometimes these are mega questions and macro questions, and other times they are filtered down into micro questions and the fine-tuning of an individual life. I found the answer to this, first of all, from the negative. You take a naturalistic framework, you live with an incoherent world. I couldn't live with that. So how do I find coherence? In putting together the diversity in my own heart, which was put together by God. And that knowledge of a personal relationship with God, which changed not only what I did, but what I wanted to do in my personal life, gave me hope, meaning, and a relationship. Let me give you just 2 quick illustrations because I think this is critical. I've had the opportunity of speaking at one of the most famous prisons in the world, Angola prison in Louisiana. Abdu was with me, some of my colleagues were with me. 6,000 plus prisoners there, 85% of whom are in life without parole. It was the bloodiest prison in America. Blood on the ceilings, blood on the carpets, blood on the walls. When a prisoner was checked in there, he was given a dagger or a knife with which to protect himself. And this warden comes in, this director comes in and says, I'm going to change this place. You allow me to do it my way. He put a Bible in every cell. He had chapel every day. He has a seminary that he's built in there. Within a matter of a year or 2, it became the safest prison in America. Today, instead of a gang of thugs, they've got gangs of pastors going through that prison out there, and they're the prisoners themselves. We had lunch with them, and I said to the guy sitting opposite us, why don't you and get yours? He said, hey man, I'm going nowhere. You may as well go and get yours, and then I'll join you. The guy who led in worship, a young man, I said to him, can I ask you a question? Because he led worship so beautifully. I said, can I ask you a question? Are you here for a life without parole? He said, yes, sir. I said, how do you feel? He said, Mr. Zacharias, if you'd known why I am here, you would never ask me that question. He said, but let me tell you something. Out there, I thought I was free. And the horrific things that I did destroyed people's lives and destroyed my own. Now inside prison bars, having found Christ, I have never been freer in my life. This is the most free I have ever been. Pray for my family. They're outside and think they are free when they are really not. And he put his arm around me and prayed for me. And there were tears running down my face. We had lunch made by the prisoners. The warden sits there, eats the lunch that the prisoners have made. Boy, you call that faith? You better believe it. And he does it. Why? They have found meaning by an individual life being conquered. When you know Christ, when you have that relationship, and your will is transformed to his will, you find out why you were made in the first place. And the crowd is just multiplied opportunity for individual conquest that God desires in every life out here tonight. I'll leave that with you.
Hi, I'm Naomi Zacharias, the director of Wellspring International. I'd like to take a minute and talk about Wellspring, which is the humanitarian arm of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. The vision of Wellspring is to identify and financially equip existing organizations aiding women and children at risk. Additionally, we work to provide individual scholarships to support education, healthcare, and basic living needs. We would love to hear from you, and we welcome your support. 100% of every gift designated for Wellspring goes directly to a project on the ground. Please call us at 770-449-6766 or email us at wellspring@rzim.org. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about Wellspring International. And now let's get back to today's teaching with Ravi Zacharias.
Next question, please.
Hi there. I was raised by a mother who was a feminist and is a questioning Christian at the moment. And she finds that there's some contradictions somewhere in the Bible that states that male have to be dominant over women and women have to be submissive. So just from a Christian perspective, does God favor a gender specifically?
And you know why? What I think, your mother has a fair question there. I don't think it's just in a vacuum or in any sense of just trying to be cavalier about it. Not just that. You think of the very nation that he chose through whom to reveal himself. He could have chosen Rome. He could have chosen Greece. He could have chosen Babylon. In fact, William T. Ears, talking about it in a piece of poetry, said, how odd of God to choose the Jews. But then he went on to say, how odder still are those who reject whom God chose. God, I think, oftentimes in life, for the human life, chooses the weakest through whom to make his strength manifest. If you were to ask me what really makes this world, let me dispel one idea here. You often hear a statement, men are more cerebral, women are more emotional. Nothing is farther from the truth. But I'll tell you what I have found. Both are equal cerebrally, but women are more consistent in willing to let the thought be connected to the emotion. Men like to hide from the emotional ramifications of the thought. So if I talk to my mother, she'd immediately connect the emotion with what she was thinking. With my father, he could draw circles around it because he'd run from the feeling. I've talked to husband and wife. We were on a vacation once, and they had both lost a son. And the woman was talking to my wife and said, it has put such a strain on our marriage because my husband doesn't even want to talk about it while I'm breaking up on the inside. They both had the same thoughts. One was running from it. The other was willing to find the greatest bridge in life between the head and the heart. So even in theory, the whole idea is wrong. Secondly, some of the finest thinking in the world has been done by womankind. You see it. So this myth has to be dispensed with. It's purely an archaic thing. But to your question, is the Bible dishonorable like this in gender? We've just had Joe Vitale, who is on our team from Oxford. She has just defended her doctoral dissertation at Oxford on this very issue and this very subject, demonstrating how strongly the Bible speaks of the equality of the genders and what it is God has in mind in the complementariness of the two. So here's my question to you. If God were a discriminator against gender, the greatest truth on which the gospel hangs is the resurrection. If Christ be not raised from the dead, our faith is in vain. Why in heaven's name did he reveal himself to the women to go and tell the message? All of Easter hangs on the testimony of womankind with whom he trusted the entire gospel. When the woman with the alabaster ointment came to him and those were frowning about her, he looked at them and said, be quiet. Wherever the gospel is preached, there shall also this be told, what this woman has done to me in worship. He paid her the greatest compliment, that the gospel would be carried to the ends of the earth, and this story of this woman's faith will also be told. He goes to Samaria, and he sees a woman of the well with 5 broken, shattered marriages. She was ethnically barred from the society, as it were, maritally broken and shattered 5 times. He made her the first evangelist to the Samaritan world. Imagine what an incredibly gracious God to remind us that none of us is superior to the other. We only have the same privilege of taking our distinctives and complementary strengths and carrying the message to the world. I can tell you this, I would never be here today if it weren't for the strength of my mother. And when my younger brother was 6 or 7 years old, he was dying with double pneumonia and typhoid. My dad had given up. Our family had given up. We were living in Delhi, and the doctor came and told us, my younger brother Ramesh, who's today the chairman of the Department of Pain Management at McMaster University in Canada. He was 6 or 7, dying. I remember seeing him as a bag of bones for the last time. I'm 6 years older than him. And I walked away from there bidding him goodbye. He was unconscious. My mother refused to leave. She refused to leave. She sat by his bedside, and we were all worn to the bone, including my dad. And so 4 of us kids packed up, taken back home, and all of us lying in bed saying, we've just lost our youngest. My mother sat by his bedside. Whatever she was doing, I don't know, and in sheer exhaustion, for days she hadn't slept, and just by his bedside crying out to God to rescue her son. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, he began to move and he was very much alive, but just quite worn out and broken. And that need of life was coming back to him. And the next day, when we all were told to come back to the hospital, his eyes were open and his whole life given fresh strength. There was only 1 out of the 6 of us there who had the strength to sit by that bedside and watch what loomed as a tragedy and watch the triumph to turn into victory. Anybody who thinks that's weak and lesser doesn't understand reality. God is the God of humankind. And the last thing Jesus said on the cross for the redemption of mankind was look at a young man and tell him not to forget his mother, to make sure she was also taken care of because a sword was piercing through her heart. That is our Lord, who treats all of us with intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. And I thank God for the beauty he has created in this complementariness.
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, I've grown up steeped in church traditions. I went to a religious school. I still go to a religious school. And I feel that perhaps indirectly I've been taught that the most important thing about Jesus is his death. And I was wondering how true that is.
Well, boy, without his death, there is no gospel. Without his resurrection, the death doesn't mean anything. I once gave a talk, great question, by the way. I once gave a talk at a business. I sort of was talking about Easter at Diversity Day, because they'd never had a thing about Easter done at this particular business. And I made this statement, and I think it's true, that Christmas without Easter is meaningless. Easter without Christmas is not possible. So you see the birth and the death and the resurrection all wrapped up into the same real, the story. The story is a beginning, middle, and end. But when Jesus was asked, why have you come? He says, for this reason I have come. He's come to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the reason. Now that ransom is his death as a payment for sin, because what the gospel tells you and tells me is this. And by the way, if I can just have a short aside here, I love Jesus for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is he's not a salesperson who tells you what you want to hear. He tells you what you need to hear. It's a very terrible sales pitch to say, you're evil, come follow me. What kind of a poster is that? But people do it anyway. He tells you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, in distinction to every other worldview, by the way, which tells you that you can do it yourself. You're the one who can make it on your own. And I think if the 24-hour news is one of the worst inventions of the past 20, 30 years. I got a clap over here on that one. But one thing it does provide us, though, is ample evidence that man is in need of a Savior who's not himself. We need someone who's not us to save us from ourselves because of our innate evil and our sin. Jesus told us that 2,000 years ago. So we need someone who can redeem us, who can pay the penalty that we deserve. Jesus says, I'm that guy. Now what's interesting is, if he died and stayed dead, then how would you know he's right? He could be dead and, well, maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong, who knows? He's like everybody else, so maybe he was wrong. But he didn't stay dead. His death is the payment. When he says on that cross, tetelestai, when he says that in the Greek, it actually means it is finished, it is accomplished. It's a financial term, paid in full. It's like a stamp on a document. The debt is paid. That is done for us. But you can know that he was right, that he took away the sins of the world through that death because of his resurrection. If he died and stayed dead, no way to know. But he didn't die and stay dead. He showed his conquering over that death, his conquering over the last enemy through the physical and, I believe, truly historical resurrection from the dead. So the death without the resurrection doesn't really show you anything, but the resurrection shows that the death meant something. In fact, let me just put it this way plainly, it meant everything. Thank you.
Some years ago, I had the privilege of speaking at the United Nations, and they had asked me to speak on a search for absolutes in a relativistic world. It's a tough subject, especially in the early hours of the morning. And you get about 18 minutes. And what I did in my talk is talked about 4 absolutes that we really look for: evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. I said we all have the desire to call some nation an evil nation. You brand some nations evil nations. But you all also talk about justice. You want just societies. You all love your families and you miss your families. And then some of you are going to blow it ethically, and you need to be forgiven. Evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. So I said to them, where in the world did all of these converge at one point in history? There was pin drop silence. I said they converged on a hill called Calvary. And as that meeting was over and I presented to them the message of Calvary, they were lined up, the ambassadors. And one of them came to me, shook my hand, and he said, Dr. Zacharias, he said, I come from an atheistic nation, and I don't want to be here. My president asked me to come here. I hate being here. I miss being here. But I want to say to you, today I have found out why I came here. I came here to find God. I came here to find God. Recently, I was in a Middle Eastern nation where the Minister of Finance came and asked if he could talk to me personally. Some of my colleagues know which one I'm talking about. He doesn't want to be there. So much violence. He sent his family out. And he said, I'm only here because of my faith and the sacrifice that Christ made for me, that I want to do my part in life. To take one aspect of the gospel and make it the most important aspect is actually that which God had joined together. Let no one put asunder. It is the birth, life, death, and resurrection. They are all put together. His death was spoken of, prophesied, and so was his resurrection. Even Paul struggled with that I may know him, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. One thing the death of Christ does is answer for me the question of evil and pain and suffering that no other worldview offers. My colleague Vince Vitale and I wrote the book, Why Suffering? And in that I made the comment that God does not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil. He conquers through it. He conquers through it. So the cross is central, but it is not in isolation, because you and I do not need a guru. We need a savior to offer and heal that which is central to your life and mine. And the Cross of Christ by John Stott is one of the most powerful books I have ever read. If you haven't read that book by John R.W. Stott, it's an all-time classic. Please take it and read it. But it fits into the grand design of God's total plan. Thank you for asking that. And now I come to this closing. And so whether you're speaking at the Center for Geopolitical Strategy in Moscow or the UN or a university or sitting next to somebody in a plane, the only answer I have seen is in the person of Jesus Christ on the 4 questions of life, of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And especially to you students, may I say this, you have a rare privilege. You have a very rare privilege. I didn't have the mind that you all do, frankly, and I'm not putting this up, but I would never have made it into a university like this. I lived for cricket. I wanted to play cricket. I was a sports person. I wanted to play cricket for India. That was my goal. I neglected my studies, never worked hard, ended up with shame on a bed of suicide. In about 2 weeks from now, I'm speaking at St. Stephen's College at the University of Delhi, probably the premier institution in the whole country of that specific nature. Anybody here from India will tell you St. Stephen's College, Delhi, Most of India's students would never even get in, and yet the principal has asked me if I would come there and present a defense of the Christian faith. God has a sense of humor. I would never have made it as a student, and now they're asking me to come and speak to them. This is how God does it, because the coherence of the Judeo-Christian worldview deals with where you are, and you have two options to go with, and I'll close with this and give you what I think would be a marvelous response on your part. Your tensions are great. Your allurements are great. Your physicality is a strength, but also makes you vulnerable. You are possibly oftentimes at the mercy of an academic who wants to knock God out of you. This happens again and again and again. I hear it so often. I will tell you this. You reject God and your worldview will become systemically incoherent. You follow the truth where it leads, and in the person of Christ you will find personal meaning and the meaning that God can help you carry it to the rest of the world. Konrad Adenauer, after the Second World War, was alone with Billy Graham. Billy Graham is not very formally educated, and he will tell you that. With a minimal education, God's anointed him. Konrad Adenauer looked at Billy Graham. Billy Graham told this to us around a gathering of lunch. And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Graham, do you believe Jesus Christ really rose from the dead? And Graham said, Mr. Adenauer, if I didn't believe that, I would have no message left to preach to the world. He said, Konrad Adenauer walked out towards the window, looked out of that window and turned around. He said, looking at the ruins of his city, he said, Mr. Graham, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. Outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. Several years ago, when I was a young man just starting my ministry living in Toronto, I was driving on the 401. It was a cold night, snowy night. I was driving in my little Volkswagen Red Bug, and I saw a guy on the side of the road thumbing for a ride on a highway. I said, somebody's going to run over him. I pulled up on the side quite late at night, about 10:30. I opened the door. I said, are you okay? He said, can you take me home, sir? I said, where do you live? And he told me it was not near my home, but I was fearful for him and fearful for myself. He's a total stranger. I said, come on in. So before he even said anything, I said, please give me your name. He said, my name is Lorne Lusthouse. I said, as we are driving, talk to me about who you are, and then I will tell you what I do. And as we were driving, he said to me, tonight's been another night. Same thing, liquor, fun, everything. He said, Ravi, I'm a messed up young guy. I'm totally messed up. He was stopping, pausing, thinking, collecting his thoughts. When I dropped him off at his home, I took his hand. I said, Lorne, I'm leaving out of town early tomorrow morning. Will you please see me when I come back next week? Here is my phone number and my address. I want to see you. I want to meet with you. He said, okay, and he took my phone number and address. When I came back, there was a letter waiting for me from Lorne Lusthouse. But when I contacted, I found out that week he had burned himself to death as well. And in my letter was this poem. I want you to think about it. Lost in a world of darkness, without a guiding light, seeking a friend to help, my struggling, failing plight. So all of you good people just go on passing by, leaving me with nothing but this lonely will to die. For somewhere in this lonely world of sorrow and of woe, there's a place for me to hide, but where, I do not know. For no matter where I go, I never will escape the devil's reaching, clutching hand or the drink of fermented grape. So out of my grief and anguish, perhaps some wandering boy will see and build his own life in this world, strong and good.